Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful and super inspiring day, and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my entire process from my preliminary pencil sketch to my painting process for this watercolor food illustration of this chocolate ice cream cone. I'm going to be explaining all about how I combine the wet on wet and the wet on dry technique and how I go about layering my color to achieve a realistic look. And as always, I'm going to be sharing tons of tips and tricks along the way. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and get started. To begin, I want to share my preliminary freehand sketching process. As always, I am using my HB drawing pencil super lightly so that I am able to erase any mistakes that I make along the way, so that I can refine my sketch along the way when needed, and also so that I don't scratch or damage my watercolor paper, and so that I'm not able to see my pencil work through my paint at the end because watercolor is translucent. As always, I made sure to work from largest shapes and made my way towards smaller shapes and details so that I can make sure to arrive at believable looking proportions for the cone and the ice cream scoop. And also, this helps me utilize my drawing space a lot more effectively versus focusing in on smaller shapes and details right off the bat. By placing my largest, most general shapes, I'm making sure that my drawing is actually in the space where I want it, in the location where I want it within my drawing area, and also in the size that I want it before moving into smaller shapes and details. I wanted to make sure to incorporate a lot of irregularity, especially in the ice cream scoop. And you can see how I started mapping out little areas where I would be creating or developing darker values during that painting process. I also want to share my little tip or process that I use for drawing little diamond shapes throughout the ice cream cone, just in case maybe it could help you too. So the first thing that I do is I lay down diagonal lines, slightly curved lines. They're not super straight, but you can see them right here, and I drew them very lightly as I possibly could. I lay them down first in one direction, and then I overlap a second group of lines on top of that to create a sort of grid or a crossing. And because there is this cross happening, this intersection of these diagonal lines, you're going to be creating a diamond shape between them. I make sure that these diamond spaces left in between make sense in terms of the little diamonds that I know are in ice cream cones. I don't want these diamond shapes to be too large or too small. I want them to sort of fall within the range that I've seen ice cream cones have. And then once I'm happy with these diagonal lines and the spaces that I've created in between them, I actually go ahead and draw in little diamond shapes in all of these spaces. And those are the little shapes that I'm going to be darkening in that painting process to make them look like they are receding. All right, so hopefully you can also see how I'm adding some irregularity along the edges of the cone as well. I feel that's going to make it look better, more realistic. And finally, I am doing something that I often do before getting started with the painting process, which is gently tapping my kneaded eraser over my drawing to soften that drawing even more. All right, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to the painting process. So for this illustration, I really just used 4 different colors, and I also brought in some white gouache at the end to do some very fine splattering to just create the illusion, give the illusion of some sugar. The white gouache is completely optional. You can totally skip that part of the process if you'd like. Alright, so the 4 colors that I used were from my St. Petersburg White Nights full pan paint set, and they are yellow ochre, burnt sienna, burnt umber, and violet. And the white gouache that I used is from Winsor & Newton's Designer's Gouache. This one that I have, for some reason, they sent me the zinc white, but I would highly recommend if you invest in a white gouache and you're planning on using it with watercolor, that you actually get the titanium white. And this is because titanium white is more opaque and thus more visible than the zinc white. Zinc white tends to be more transparent and weaker. So whenever I'm going to be bringing in white gouache to use with watercolor, and I actually want to bring in the gouache because I know that I want more opaque white paint for those visible details, I always want to make sure that I am using opaque white paint. And this is exactly why I don't like using white watercolor paint, because white watercolor is transparent. White watercolor may definitely have some opaqueness to it when compared to other more translucent colors. But all in all, if you try to do this splattering technique with white watercolor, it's not really going to be very visible at all. And sometimes it just leads to a chalky look. I'm going to be using a total of 4 round brushes to create this piece, a size 6, a size 4, and a size 2. And I have an extra size 5 round brush that I am going to be bringing in at the end to do my splattering with the white gouache. I'm going to get started with preparing some yellow ochre for myself with a bit of water right there in the top little well on my color mixing palette. After that, I'm going to be creating a light reddish brown by mixing together my yellow ochre with my burnt sienna. After that, I'm going to be creating an even darker brown, and this is going to be created by mixing together my burnt sienna plus my burnt umber. And after that, I'm going to be creating an even deeper and darker brown by mixing together my burnt umber and my violet. These are the color mixtures that I'm going to be using along the way, both to paint in the ice cream scoop as well as the cookie or the cone. And if I run out of any of these along the painting process, I'll just go ahead and make some more. For me and my painting style, which is a little bit more on the realistic side of the spectrum, it's just so important to know what different colors and color mixtures I am going to be using to be able to develop a wide variety of colors and values. Because a value or having very light areas, mid-tones, and very dark areas is essential in order to give something a sense of three-dimensional form and volume. And yes, when it comes to working with watercolor, you can certainly create a wide variety of different translucencies and values using just one color. However, I always mix colors together to create deeper, darker values than just one color allows. And for me personally, I just enjoy doing my color mixing on my color mixing palette and not so much having my colors intermix on my paper. Alright, so right here, I just wanted to show you how juicy these color mixers are that I've created for myself on my color mixing palette. They have a good amount of paint in them, but also some water. You can see some movement in them. And right here, I'm just going to swatch out these colors for you on my scrap piece of watercolor paper, which I would always recommend having scrap pieces of watercolor paper on hand whenever you're painting with this medium, so that you can see what they look like. Okay, so here are my 4 swatches, and right around here, I'm just going to point out for you that these 3 ones on the top, I'm going to be using to paint in the cone, and the 3 browns in the bottom, I'm going to be using to paint in the chocolate ice cream scoop. I personally always like working from the lightest color of the group that I've prepared for myself for the given area on hand that I am painting in, and I make my way towards the darker color. And for this kind of piece in which I'm not really going to be bringing in tons of expressive color use, I always like giving thought to bridge tones, bridge colors and transitions, making sure that I am moving forward a step at a time between my colors and my values. Alright, so I took time to change my water because after having created my color mixtures, it was pretty murky and I wanted to make sure that it was nice and clean before I started in with my pre-wetting. So with my clean water on hand, I started using my size 6 round brush to carefully pre-wet just the cone section. I took my time with it. I went over everything at least 3 to 4 times and made sure to arrive at a nice even sheen all throughout this section. I made sure that I didn't have any puddles anywhere, and I allowed that water to settle on my paper just a tiny bit before I started dropping in my color. You want a nice, even glistening all throughout. And if certain sections of your pre-wetted shape start to dry way too fast, it probably means that you haven't pre-wetted enough. You want to make sure that you pre-wet this area effectively so that you're able to do a good amount of work before certain sections start to dry on you. Because the moment certain sections start to dry, it is going to be time to allow everything to dry completely. And this is why I like doing pre-wetting, because by doing pre-wetting, I have a little bit more working time before things start to dry on me when compared to starting to paint on paper that is dry. All right, so once my paper had been pre-wetted, I started by dropping in the lightest color of the bunch that I prepared for the cone, which is, of course, as I mentioned, the yellow ochre. I dropped in a bit of yellow ochre at a time, and once I felt I had a good amount of paint on my paper, I removed the color from my paintbrush bristles and I went back in to help that color move and expand out a little bit to create soft gradients. And even at this point in the painting process in which I'm just developing that very first layer, I want to make sure that I'm developing somewhat of a range of translucencies and values even within this layer. So you can see how I've left certain sections in which that paint is super light and translucent, and you see a lot of that white paper shining through, and others in which that yellow ochre is slightly more saturated. This is so that I can start developing that sensation of 3D form and light even with this first layer of paint. If you go in and don't think of that three-dimensional cone form and you start just painting in a very flat, uniform value or level of translucency all throughout, that is probably going to lead to flatness and maybe even heaviness at the end. You always want to make sure that you're incorporating the whiteness of the paper underneath so that you can really, use the medium's translucency and develop that sense of 3D form and light. Always remember to use a medium's translucency to your advantage. This is what distinguishes watercolor, what sets it apart from opaque painting mediums such as acrylics or oils. Really incorporating the whiteness and the beauty of the paper under the paint and making it part of the process and the development of our different values. Once I felt I had a good amount of yellow ochre on my paper for that first layer of paint, I started placing my second brown. This is a yellow ochre plus the burnt sienna. As you can see, I am dropping in just a bit of the second brown, and I'm being very deliberate about where I drop in this second color, because I want to make sure that I'm only darkening certain sections where I'm going to be developing darker values in. And because my paper is still wet, it's still in a workable state, because I took time to do my pre-wetting before getting started with the painting process, I still have time to develop darker values and even start developing some texture in this part of the illustration before having to allow everything to dry completely. My paper has not yet arrived at that awkward drying state, which if I went in to try to deepen and darken certain things or move paint around, I would just be left with splotchiness and an overworked look. Now, having said all this, you can certainly paint in large sections like this, wet on dry, and arrive at beautiful looking results. It's just that you have to work pretty quickly. And because sometimes I like taking my time with this and I like being able to do as much work as possible before allowing layers to dry, I just like doing the pre-wetting process before starting to drop in my color. It's really just a matter of personal preference and how I like working. All right, so right here, I'm already starting to do some work with the darkest brown that I've prepared for this section, which is a burnt sienna plus the burnt umber. And as you can see, the darker I get, the more I limit myself to the amount of paint that I drop in. I make sure to only place it in sections of darker values that I want to develop. And then I go back to the medium brown to drop it into certain sections to start developing a little bit of texture in the cone. I continue dropping in a bit of color at a time, and after I feel I've placed enough, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in to soften textures that maybe I didn't like too much, or to create soft gradients by just pulling that color out, etc. And along this painting process, you've probably seen me use my absorbent towel time and time again to stay on top of water control. If I ever accidentally place way too much paint / water on my paper, I go in and do some quick lifting with my absorbent towel or the clean and slightly damp bristles of my paintbrush. I use them sometimes as a little absorbent sponge to lift up some of that paint from my paper. But I also oftentimes just touch the tip of my paintbrush to my absorbent towel to remove excess drippage. Okay, so by this point, I'm pretty happy with the development of different values and textures that I've achieved throughout the cone. And it's almost about time to allow this layer to dry completely, but I just want to point out here that I've already managed to create a good amount of value development and texture development, and my paper is still wet. No section of that cone has started to dry on me or has reached that semi-dry, awkward state at which I really shouldn't be doing much at all. But I'm happy with how everything is looking in the cone, and it was time to allow that to dry completely. I allowed everything to dry naturally. You can definitely use a hair dryer if you want to speed up the drying process. I changed my water, and it was time to start pre-wetting the ice cream scoop section. I have been using my size 6 round brush for this entire process, both for the pre-wetting and also for these beginning layers. After having done my pre-wetting, you can see me start dropping in the lightest color that I've prepared for this area, which is my yellow ochre plus burnt sienna color mixture. And just like what I did with the cone, I am dropping in a bit of color at a time, and I am making sure to leave certain sections with a very, very small amount of paint in them. And certain sections even have that whiteness of the paper shining through completely, and I left them unpainted. So again, it really is all about bringing to mind the three-dimensional structure or form, as well as the texture of whatever it is that you're painting, and really trying to develop a wide variety of values and translucencies with your paint so that you can start creating a sense of 3D form and light. Once I felt I had a good amount of that lightest brown that I prepared for this section, I then started placing the second brown, which was the burnt sienna plus the burnt umber, in sections throughout that I wanted to darken more. And every time I place more color, once I feel I've placed enough color on my paper, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in with a clean and only slightly damp paintbrush and soften that paint a little bit more. If I feel that paint needs help expanding out a little bit and creating gradients into lighter value areas, or I feel I've maybe developed a little bit too much texture that I don't like, I go in with my paintbrush bristles, which are clean and don't have any paint in them, just a little bit of water, and smooth that color out. And at this point, I'm even going in with the darkest brown that I prepared for this area, which is the burnt umber plus the violet. And you can see how deep and dark this brown is. Initially, when I drop it in, it looks super, super dark. So once I feel I've placed enough of this darkest brown, I again remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in and soften with my paintbrush. I merge the previous browns and this one together to create gradients. And remember that you can always go in with either your absorbent towel or the clean and slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush to do some lifting if you feel you've placed way too much paint. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with the development of different brown values all throughout this ice cream scoop. I have very, very light areas in which that brown is very, very light and pale. I have mid-tone areas and I have very dark brown areas. So that's essentially the first thing that I wanted to do. And what I am doing now is I'm just enhancing a little bit of that texture. So I'm jumping back and forth between my medium brown and my darkest brown. And I'm even using my smallest brush for this, which is my size 2 round. You can see me go in and gently drop in both the medium brown as well as the darkest brown. Sometimes I am doing kind of streaks or longer strokes. And other times I'm just very gently touching the tip of my paintbrush to my paper to drop in a little bit of a darker color here and there just to continue developing a little bit more of that ice cream texture. I don't want to overdo it and start darkening lightest areas because then I'm gonna get rid of those lightest values. Just a little bit goes a long way. All right, so it was time to allow that chocolate ice cream area to dry completely. And now I'm gonna get back to work on the ice cream cone. We are going to be working on darkening the diamond shapes in the cone to make them recede a little bit. And what you're seeing me do right here is I'm just going over certain diamond shapes that I feel have been covered up by paint and I cannot see very well. So depending on how dark you made that preliminary sketch and how much of your sketch you're able to see. You can certainly feel free to do this as well. Just make sure that if you're gonna be sketching anything in at this point, that everything is 100% completely dry and that you still don't go in and press your pencil down too hard, because you don't want to scratch or damage your paper, and you also don't want to see that pencil work through your paint at the end. With my little diamond shapes sketched in, it was time to get started with the painting process in these little shapes. And what I am doing is I am using my size 2 round brush, and I am going back to the first color that I used for the cone, which is the pure yellow ochre with some water in it. It's pretty watery. You can see how I tested out that yellow ochre on my scrap piece of watercolor paper before going in, because I didn't want to go in super saturated with that yellow ochre in a very dry state initially. I wanted it to be pretty translucent, and with that little diamond shape painted in with the semi-translucent yellow ochre, while that yellow ochre was still wet, I then dropped in my second brown that I prepared for myself for the cone, which is a yellow ochre plus the burnt sienna. And if you drop it into that diamond while it's still wet with the yellow ochre, then that second darker brown is going to create nice diffused out edges as it merges into that wetness. Make sure that you're working on just a few diamond shapes at a time. I would say anywhere from 3 to 5 little diamond shapes. Paint them in with your watered down yellow ochre. You can see me go over the shapes at least 3 to 4 times before dropping in the second brown, so that I can ensure that those shapes are still gonna be pretty wet by the time that I drop in the second brown, so that I can have those nice diffused out effects and little soft gradients between the two browns. Now I am trying to drop in the second brown along a couple of the edges of those diamond shapes, so that I can have a little bit of the two browns showing through at the end in these little diamonds. However, if the paint expands out for that second brown and I no longer see too much of that initial yellow ochre, then that's perfectly okay. I don't fuss about it too much. I just allow the paint to do its own thing. Later on, we're going to be using the third color that we prepared for ourselves for the cone to darken certain sections within these diamond shapes. So this is going to enable us to develop an even greater variety of values within these little diamond shapes. So as long as at the end I have a nice variety of golden tones and browns inside of these little diamond shapes, and the values created inside of the diamond shapes are darker than the ones outside of the diamond shapes, then I am happy. Okay, I'm gonna go quiet for just a bit as I continue working on these little diamond shapes in the cone, and you're gonna see me bring in the third brown that I prepared for myself for the cone, which is the burnt sienna plus the burnt umber, when I get to work on that left section of the cone. And this is because even in this layer, I want to start creating the illusion of a bit of a more shadow and overlapping effects where that cookie is on the other section of the cookie. It's super important that you really acknowledge all of these different value shapes as abstract, irregular shapes. Stay away from the look of outlines, because outlines are not present in realism. You're going to really retract from the level of realism of your work if you start developing outlines. And also stay away from the look of harsh looking shapes, very deep dark shapes or marks or anything like that that can just be way too distracting for the viewer. And continue coming back to the picture as a whole and not getting too distracted with any one specific place. All right, so it is time to allow that cone to dry completely, and I am going to get to work on the second layer of paint in the ice cream scoop. So I switched on back to my size 6 round brush to do some pre-wetting before starting to drop in my paint. When you do pre-wetting on paint that has already dried, on a section that you've already worked on, you want to make sure that you're doing it very, very gently. You don't want to start scrubbing or reactivating that color and starting to just flatten out all of the different values that you've already created. I'd recommend making sure that you're using paintbrushes that have very soft bristles, that you don't go in with too much pressure as you're doing your pre-wetting. And also, of course, the type of paper that you're using. There are just some types of paper that lend themselves more to this type of layering and doing pre-wetting on paint that has already dried, because I've definitely used paper before that, you go in with a second layer of paint or to do some pre-wetting and the entire first layer of paint starts moving around, and that's very frustrating. And that has happened to me even on paper that is 100% cotton. I've never had issues with this Canson Heritage 140-pound cold pressed paper when I'm using this technique, and of course it also works great with arches. Okay, so the objective with the second layer of paint in this ice cream scoop is to deepen and darken darkest brown sections within this ice cream scoop, as well as possibly enhance that texture a little bit more. You do not want to cover up lighter value areas because you'd flatten things out and we would get rid of that realistic effect. So after having done my pre-wetting with my size 6 round brush, I switched on over to my size 4 round brush, and I am basically using my two darkest browns. So I'm jumping between my mixture with the burnt sienna plus the burnt umber and my burnt umber plus violet color mixture. I use the medium brown to do little tiny drop-ins of color, just touching the tip of my paintbrush on my paper so that I can create a little bit more texture. I also use that medium brown to do kind of linear strokes to develop that texture, and I only drop in the darkest brown that has the violet in it in darkest value sections where I want to deepen those values more. At certain points, I switch on back to the smallest size 2 round brush to do some very, very thin linear strokes. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how everything is looking in the ice cream. It's time to allow that to dry completely, and I am now getting to work on darkening darkest value sections in the cookie. So at this point, I am going to be working with my smallest round brush, my size 2, and I am going to be using the two darkest browns that I created for myself for the cookie, which are the yellow ochre plus the burnt sienna and the burnt sienna plus the burnt umber. At this point, we're only darkening darkest value sections within those little mid-tone shapes. So this is why we're using these two darker browns. So I'm going in initially with the medium brown, painting that little shape in wet on dry, and only dropping in the darkest brown in little sections within that while it's still wet. When you're painting in little shapes like these, it's super, super important to stay on top of water control. You don't want to go in with a ton of water / paint on your bristles because all of a sudden you can start losing control. When it comes to staying on top of water control, there are tons of tips and tricks that I could share with you, but it really all comes down to just continuing to check on how much water is in or how wet 3 things are throughout the painting process. Number 1, how much water / paint is in your paintbrush bristles. Number 2, how wet is your paper already in that area that you're working on? And number 3, how watery is your paint mixture? You have to make sure that you're noticing the amount of water in or on these three things throughout the painting process in order to avoid accidents and also to arrive at the effects that you're looking for. It's when you stop paying attention and start mindlessly placing more water and paint, or don't allow things to dry completely before coming back in to attempt to darken or add further detail, or you're not modifying the paint to water ratio in your color mixtures when you're working, that things start to happen that you maybe weren't anticipating, or that can lead to mistakes that you're not going to be able to easily fix. As you continue practicing with watercolor, the easier it gets for you to notice these things, the easier it gets for you to know when exactly it is that you should be dropping in your paint on that paper. When you should just touch the tip of your paintbrush on your absorbent towel to remove that excess strippage. When you should allow layers of paint to dry. When you should be adding more water or paint into your color mixtures, etc. and so forth. You start doing all of these things throughout the painting process just subconsciously, but it really comes down to practice and getting to know the medium. And if you're just getting started with this medium and you find all of this super confusing, you're having trouble with water control, I'm gonna make sure to leave links to a couple of videos that I've created with exercises and must-know information that are gonna help you develop these skills faster. I'm gonna make sure to leave those links down below for you in the description box. Okay, I'm gonna continue working on this cone. You can definitely feel free to go over certain sections in past little diamond shapes that you've painted in. I would just recommend making sure that you allow that previous layer to dry completely before going in to darken certain sections within them. All right, before moving on to the very last part of this process, which is going to be doing our splattering with the white gouache, I'm going to be darkening little shapes in the ice cream section just a little bit more, this time on paper that is completely dry. So this means that the shapes that I am going to be painting in at this point are going to have sharp and defined edges around them because I'm painting them on dry paper. I'm once again using my smallest round brush that I've selected for this process, which is my size 2 round brush. And I am going in with the two darkest browns, but I am making sure to go in with these colors in a pretty translucent state. I am going in with a very small amount of color in my paintbrush, and this color is pretty watered down. I am constantly testing out my color mixtures on my scrap piece of watercolor paper, as you can see, so that I can make sure that these darker brown colors are not super saturated when I am painting in these abstract irregular shapes. And this is because since I am painting in these shapes on dry paper, they're already going to look a little bit more sharp and defined, and I don't want to go in with color that is way too dark because I can accidentally create lines, marks, and shapes that are way too distracting, way too visible, and I don't want to do that. So this is why I want to make sure that even though I am using my two darkest browns, that these colors are pretty transparent. I want to be relatively subtle with the details and the darkness that I'm adding in at this point, and always remember less is more. Right here, you can see me use this smallest round brush, and I'm using different kinds of brush strokes. Sometimes I'm pressing down the belly of my paintbrush when I am creating larger abstract irregular shapes for darker areas that I want to deepen and darken. And other times I'm using more scribbling motions and linear motions or linear strokes when I want to enhance or describe that texture a little bit better. All right, you guys, we are moving on to the very final part of this painting process. And this is the final little details that I'm gonna be adding in with my white gouache. And as I said, we're gonna be using the splattering technique. So I am going to be using a separate size 5 round brush for this. I like using a separate brush for my white gouache. This is just a personal preference. When I'm gonna be doing splattering with white gouache, I always like bringing in a few little drops of water into my white gouache and swiveling my paintbrush in there so that I can really modify its consistency, because it's usually pretty thick right out of the tube. And it's important that the consistency is just right before you do your splattering. If you've never done splattering before, I would recommend actually testing out the consistency of the paint and testing out this technique with flicking the bristles of your paintbrush with your index finger on a separate piece of paper before actually attempting to do this on your painting. You want to make sure that the consistency is just right and that you have the technique down so that that splattering can be very fine. It's also super easy to go overboard with it, so make sure that you're not adding way too much splattering. This is just a final detail to provide a little bit of an illusion of sugar. This splattering technique also works great for when you are going to be working on winter landscapes for your snow. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you found some helpful nuggets in it, that you found it inspiring, and if you did, pretty please, I'd super appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up and share with family or friends who you think would find it helpful as well. That really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows others to get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and keep on creating. Bye guys!